Good morning, everyone. I am Ryan Berg. I am the Director of the Program for the Americas from the Center of Strategic Studies and International Studies in Washington, D.C. We thank you for your participation in this talk on assessing the impact of Mano Dura policies on democracy in Latin America. Before getting started, allow me to mention a few logistical items. This event will last approximately 60 minutes. During the event, we have simultaneous interpretation available in English and Spanish. On your Zoom screens, to the bottom right, you will find a globe icon that says Interpretation, where you can choose your language of preference. Now in English.
We will have simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish during this event today. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, please click on the globe button that says Interpretation and select your preferred language.
The event will begin with the Adjunct Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean for USAID, Milady Guilarte. Then the panelists will engage in a moderated panel, and at the end we'll have time for questions from the audience. Please send in your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom or using the event's website. For several decades, the term Mano Dura has referred to security policies that have been implemented by several governments in Latin America to combat violence by gangs and criminal activity. These strategies tend to imply an increase in police and military presence, the use of aggressive tactics for law enforcement, and massive arrests, together with imposing more severe penalties against those who are involved in criminal activities. But the tactics used as part of the Mano Dura have been evolving, and it is imperative for us to reassess the new manifestations of Mano Dura in the region, as well as the impact it has had on democracy. By assessing the effects of Mano Dura, the governments in the region tend to signal a reduction in murder rates, the high rates of incarceration, and a high rate of military and police presence in a determined geographical location in the country. However, the lack of legal representation and due process, together with inhumane conditions under arrest and the excessive use of force, together with deaths while in custody, are some of the negative effects that Mano Dura has had and are often left aside. This approach creates an environment of fear and repression, suffocating political dissidents and limiting civil liberties. The resulting erosion of these democratic norms reduce public trust in government institutions and weaken democratic governance in general. What's most concerning is that the Mano Dura policies are not only manifesting themselves in the streets of Latin America, but also in the online world. In a fragmented media environment where information is consumed instantly and the meta-narratives prevail, leaders in Latin America have been able to capitalize social anxiety to consolidate their power and promote agendas that, in many cases, place liberties and human rights at risk. To dive deeper into our understanding of the effects of Mano Dura policies on democracy, we've invited exceptional panelists, and we've invited them to prepare 5 minutes of opening words. But before beginning with the discussion with the experts, I'd like to introduce the Adjunct Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean from USAID, Mrs. Milady Guilarte. Milady Guilarte is responsible for USAID programs that seek to promote democracy and governance, economic growth, and climate change in Latin America. She also collaborates regularly with other government organizations in the United States, and other international bodies that are interested in humanitarian in the humanitarian response and development in these countries for a coordinated effort. Recently, she directed the Office of Latin America and the Caribbean that oversees the response by the agency to the migratory challenges throughout the Western Hemisphere. Please go ahead, Administrator Guilarte. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ryan, and thanks to CSIS and our project supported by USAID for the opportunity to be here with all of you. Today's event is undoubtedly important, as we have seen, given the high levels of murder rates, gang violence, and transnational crime in Latin America and the Caribbean, the region is at a point of inflection. We are seeing how some leaders and sectors of society are tending towards Mano Dura policies, increasing positions in saying we either protect security or we protect human rights, but we cannot do both. And these arguments have gained true strength as governments have shown its citizens that they can make true progress on matters of security in the short term with Mano Dura policies against criminals. Having lived for some time in El Salvador in one of the most violent periods in recent times, I saw firsthand the impact that crime can have on communities whose inhabitants could no longer continue with their daily lives given the violence. Many expressed that they were fearful of leaving at night, and they were concerned about when and not if they would become victims of crime. In turn, crime was having a significant impact on the economy. I left El Salvador feeling that the living conditions for many sectors of the population were truly unacceptable. Fundamentally, it is the responsibility of the state to provide security. However, what we see throughout the region is that security is often reduced to increasing the levels of police and military and reducing basic laws, which can lead to repression by the authorities and the government, who officially sanction measures without measuring the consequences to the detriment of due process and fundamental rights of citizens. Which helps to sustain the issue of violence. We know that security is not just about reducing crime, but also about helping people to feel safe in their own communities, with access to justice and support services to live a full life. Mostly, when it comes to organized crime and its effects on the communities, people want immediate solutions. On our side, USAID supports community programs for preventing violence against people and communities at risk, as well as activities that promote the institutions that are in charge of law enforcement to protect people's security. So we ask ourselves, how can we break down with this false dichotomy of choosing between security or human rights, when Mano Dura policies are becoming an increasingly persuasive and popular option to combat crime? The answer is, well, we've seen that it's not about exchanging rights for security. Both must be bolstered under the rule of law to make security sustainable while respecting citizens' human rights. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that we do not have enough data or a full view on how Mano Dura policies are impacting countries individually, especially in the medium and long term. We need further research as to how to effectively balance the citizens' demands for immediate response with a more comprehensive approach that, first of all, addresses the factors that lead to crime and violence, working with families, communities, governments, organizations from civil society, schools, the health sector, the corporate community, the media, and others. That is where LACLEARN comes in. For those of you who do not know about LACLEARN, it seeks to find inclusive and sustainable solutions to the complex challenges in the region. Financed by USAID, LACLEARN gathers ideas, actors, and local voices to promote current knowledge and to inform on public policy and influence on developmental decision-making, on security, on citizen security and human rights. The latest research from LACLEARN has had the goal of expanding our understanding of Mano Dura policies, analyzing the implications of said policies beyond the security sector, and paying close attention to the voices of citizens who experience the impact of these policies every single day in Latin America and the Caribbean. LACLEARN is supporting this research in association with Flexo Chile, the Dutch Institute for Democracy, for Multi-Party Democracy, and the Center of Strategic and International Studies, who will provide us with updates on the results of this significant research. So you might ask yourselves now, what can we do with this important work? Our intent as USAID is to have this valuable information be amplified to governments, NGOs, academia, civil society, and many of you here, to thus influence on policies and programming that can enhance citizen security. I'm eager to hear from my colleagues about the findings, but before concluding, I'd like to take a brief moment to thank the members of the advisory group that supported this effort: Cynthia Arndt, Rafael Gude, Jose Luis Sanz, and Veronica Subillaga. They provided their time and experience for free to enrich the dialogue and strengthen the final products. I hope to continue to engage in this conversation on the issue. And with this, I'll give the floor back to Ryan. Thank you. Thank you so much, Adjunct Administrator Guilarte, for your opening words. And thank you for your work at USAID throughout the region. So let's begin with the panel. And the first presenter is Lucia Dammert, who is a professor in the School of Humanities at the University of Santiago de Chile. She has published articles and books on community engagement, citizen security, social conflictivity, and urban issues in national and domestic and international journals. As part of the LACLEARN initiative, Lucia researched Mano Dura and the erosion of democracy in Latin America, which focused on the countries of Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Uruguay. Our second panelist is Christopher Hernandez Roy. He is the Deputy Director and Researcher in the Program for the Americas here at CSIS. Throughout his over 25 years of experience, Chris has worked extensively to promote democratic governance, prevent and resolve conflict, strengthen the rule of law, respect human rights, ensure citizen security, and promote comprehensive development in Latin America and the Caribbean. As part of the LACLEARN initiative, Chris has held dialogues with journalists, members of academia, members of civil society, to discuss the effects of Mano Dura in democracy. And our third and last panelist is Wim Savenije, a researcher from the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy, or NIMD from its initials. He is a social scientist who has studied matters of insecurity, violence, gangs, prevention, police, and security policies in El Salvador and Central America in general. As part of the LACLEARN initiative, Wim researched the democratic reverse on governance and security in Central America in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So today we have an extraordinary panel, and I'd like to begin with words by Lucia. So please go ahead, Lucia. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks to CSIS also for this conversation. And of course, to LACLEARN and USAID for having allowed us to engage in this project. We just have 5 minutes, so I will be very brief in my comments about why we did a project that we did. The first thing I should say is that, well, Mano Dura is not a concept that is only discussed in certain parts of Latin America, nor is it just a discussion that is had in places where violence is totally unleashed or that have a long history of high murder rates, as is the case of maybe Guatemala, El Salvador, and certain parts of Mexico, certain parts of Brazil. And in that regard, our proposal was to study the countries that historically were considered as exceptional in Latin America, given their low murder rates, given their low levels of institutional corruption, their creative capacity also to develop these prevention programs with community police. And for this, we created a consortium with Sebastian Cotrona, Jonathan Ross, and others who have worked extensively on these issues. And together with the Santiago University, we implemented a project not necessarily based on the initial response to the surveys. And of course, this was all done with the support of USAID, but also with in-depth interviews and focus groups. And this was really important because Mano Dura would seem to be an emotional response. And obviously, when you have a crisis, you emotionally plead for someone to resolve that. And if someone can resolve it quickly or with a certain level of punishment to say things are good, it is accepted. But in our conversations, we found that Mano Dura also has certain sub-characteristics or certain complexities, let's say, when it comes time to actually sit down and talk. The first thing we found after quite some time, actually, under this program, we published an article seeking to identify what Mano Dura actually meant. Not just what it meant in terms of citizens, which is much more complex as we've seen in the study, but also what it means in conceptual terms and therefore how it impacts public policy. Mano Dura for people means many things, and to the academia and politicians, also many things. It is true that today Mano Dura is much more associated with the process taking place in El Salvador under President Bukele specifically, but we all know that Mano Dura programs have been implemented in Latin America for at least 2 decades, some with a direct name, Mano Dura, as we've seen in El Salvador, others disguised as control and repression policies, but it is a long-standing policy of Mano Dura in the region. In that regard, then, our most significant finding was the need to understand, and we've actually proposed 4 ways of understanding Mano Dura as a concept and also as a policy. Obviously, we have institutional policies for Mano Dura. It's what we call institutional Mano Dura, where what they do is emerge from government institutions under standing regulatory frameworks that mostly seek to increase penalties and fines, the use of the armed forces on matters of public security. And let's say these are the measures that are discussed permanently, but that are parts of the democratic capacity in many of our countries that implement them. But that is not the only way that Mano Dura is used in the region. The second way that we found is what we have called a more of an undercover Mano Dura, which involves efforts that are not just institutional, but also that work outside the regulatory framework and that oftentimes hide the levels of violence and corruption, not just in the police forces and armed forces and other organizations tasked with security. In many conversations, citizens have recognized that they support this undercover Mano Dura to, again, accept higher levels of security. And the third type of Mano Dura is what we call performative Mano Dura. Let's recall that we have many actors, especially during electoral times, that have a significant narrative and creative skills when it comes to policy. And these are policies that we know do not work, and we'll be discussing this later. But at the end of the day, they do respond to the urgency of the issue, and set aside the responsibility of coming in with things such as death penalties, chemical castration, the increase of sentences ad infinitum. So it's really important, and the results have shown this, that we also determine what we call civil mano dura. These would be citizen actions, no longer necessarily institutional, that are also involved in trying to resolve security issues, oftentimes connected with sensationalism and with this feeling, rather, that they cannot be resolved otherwise. This involves lynches and citizen groups conducting security. It's important to recall that in many cases, and even in these countries that are countries that have increased their rates but are still much below the average regionally, apart from Ecuador, of course, citizens are also open to these kinds of discussions. So I believe it's important to propose this conceptual view and then acknowledge that in countries, and I'm sure I'll dive deeper into this with the questions, but in the countries that we've studied, these are countries that are open to these discussions, that are increasingly clear as far as the use of mano dura, and that mano dura be used not only for matters of criminal justice, but also for other fields of daily life. And in most countries that we've studied, we are still seeing institutional mano dura, but the levels of erosion of democracy have been contained. However, with the text and subtext in conversations with the citizens reflect openness to other types of efforts that may be called violence or mano dura. I will stop here for time reasons and I'll continue later. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lucia, for your words. And congratulations on your findings from your study. I'd like to give the floor now to Chris Hernandez-Roy. Thank you so much, Ryan. It's truly a pleasure to be at this event with my old friend Lucia and Win, and of course the Deputy Assistant Administrator Milady Guilarte. Our project consisted of surveying local voices together with international experts to explore the impacts of mano dura on democracy and human rights, inclusion, and governance, and how mano dura policies are transmitted and what alternatives could be used given their attractiveness. This was an exercise to create a conversation around mano dura and to expand the wide range of opinions from academics, civil society, journalists, and other stakeholders. For this, we organized 3 roundtables. One secondary objective was to reunite these people, to engage as a community, to continue then to discuss these issues after the project was done. The premise of our roundtables was that in assessing mano dura policies and its impact, governments can create alternative strategies against criminals while ensuring transparency, the rule of law, and law enforcement based on human rights. The first roundtable focused on the impact of mano dura policies on democracy and human rights, and on the groups and vulnerable and minority groups. We had work sessions to assess each of its impacts individually. The participants shared ideas on how mano dura policies have led to significant changes in governance, public security, the relationship between government and its citizens in Ecuador and El Salvador and Honduras. The general subject was around democratic norms, the impact to human rights, and the centralization of power with the pretext of ensuring public security. The second roundtable examined the strategies, or rather the narratives and the discourse power of those who promote mano dura policies. Digital media and social networks have allowed Latin American governments to favor these policies by presenting biased results and limiting counter narratives by using disinformation campaigns, among other means. The findings of these discussions highlighted the systematic use of propaganda and digital communications, particularly in El Salvador. The third and last roundtable approached the difficult challenge of developing short-term alternatives, given that Mano Dura produces results that have been very well received in El Salvador and other countries. The general conclusion was that there is no magic wand for citizen security. Another key finding was that there is no single alternative to Mano Dura, although participants agreed in general that the interventions at the community level and creating policies based on data and social and economic programs were important to achieve sustainable levels of violence. The results of the interventions varied from one country to another. To reduce the attractiveness of Mano Dura, our participants felt that democratic governments must work with civil society and the international community to expose the noxious effects of Mano Dura, not just against human rights or in concentrating power, but also because they can alter the citizens' behaviors outright. And this can be achieved by reducing the asymmetry of information in the current Mano Dura models. That is, balancing the narrative around the Mano Dura models with a counter-narrative that is equally convincing, that highlights the hidden costs of such policies. They suggested that this should go hand in hand with narratives on the non-exportability of the model, given that countries should consider their own specific context around security, and it is very unlikely that the experience of El Salvador can be replicable elsewhere, even in its neighboring Honduras, where by replicating El Salvador's models, there has not been the same effect. With regard to communications around Mano Dura, the participants thought that the counter narratives online were successful when done by victims or family members of those affected by Mano Dura. That is, first-hand experiences instead of NGO reports, for example. Success also is increased when counter-narratives are disseminated via the information systems used by the majority of the population, which may vary from country to country, and when disseminated with a certain frequency as well. Initially, with regard to creating alternative strategies that are effective to provide improvements in citizen security that can compete with Mano Dura policies, the participants highlighted the fact that there's a need for greater education, given that school education is closely associated with gang behavior. Focusing on the local, at the municipal or the neighborhood level is also key, given that oftentimes the major challenges around security focus on geographic areas that are relatively small, where policies designed to be applicable at the national level may not be the right answer there. And lastly, having governments explain in writing and publishing their citizen security policies so that there can be a political debate and accountability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, for your words and for the findings that you have communicated. Now I would like to give the floor to Wim. Go ahead, Wim. Thank you. Wim? Can you hear me now? Thank you for being here. I would like to share the first findings of the study together with Lucia and Chris. Thank you for the presence of the administrator of USAID and for her support. Our approach in our study on Mano Dura and its risks for democracy is based on the popularity of Mano Dura policies and sometimes the demands of the population, the demand that the government does something stronger because previous efforts have failed. We are concerned that in El Salvador, President Bukele has removed several rights, several constitutional rights, and he imprisoned many people who might be innocent. And the population knows this. However, he's still highly popular with his policies of state of exception, not only in El Salvador, but his policies have been welcomed in Argentina, Uruguay, Honduras, and of course, Ecuador. So we're wondering what's happening here. So people are willing to offer their rights in exchange for security and a trade-off between more security and less democracy. We're highly doubtful of this. We don't think it's that easy. However, we found it very important to understand it. So we talked to the people, not just NGOs or political leaders. We met with just common citizens, people who are not part of the discussion on media, but they are exposed to the discourse from the media and social networks. And we wanted to hear from them. What did they think about losing some of their rights? What do they think about their economic situation, or also in matters of security? What do they expect from the government? And whether they are willing to accept extraordinary measures, Mano Dura or something stronger, such as the state of exception in El Salvador, in order to obtain more security. And what does that mean? Does it mean to feel safer on the streets, not being mugged or raped? Or is it also in financial terms? I believe what we saw in the three countries, well, let me explain first. We made a comparison between El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala because El Salvador already has a strong state of exception in place, and it has offered security. In Honduras and Guatemala, discourse is there, but the situation's still the same. There's still fear. It's similar to what El Salvador was before the state of exception. So it can showcase a bit of change, and it can show whether the El Salvador case is worth it. Let me highlight the fact among the first results. Throughout the region, the three countries are used to surrendering their rights to powerful agents, whether gangs, security forces, and this is perceived very differently between genders. Nowadays, young men are usually stopped by the police and they can be sent to jail because they are allegedly members of gangs. Meanwhile, women are victims of sexual harassment or they get catcalled. It used to be the same. The gangs were seeking men to recruit them to be part of their systems, and they viewed women as sexual objects. So there is a longstanding tradition of restriction of rights. And in democracy, that's what there is. It is important to vote when it comes to elections, but there's not a lot of trust in the system. There's not a lot of trust that the vote count will be right or that politicians will deliver on their promises. So at the same time, there's a lot of resignation. There's no other system, nothing will be better, and there's no way out. However, in El Salvador, there was a change in security. And I need to mention that everyone acknowledges the fact that there's more security. There's a lot more security. But there used to be mentions of delays in the presence of police, and now there's a lot of discretionality. People can't go to jail and never come out. This is targeted towards young men and their families. So families are afraid of going out to the street with their young men, young male sons, and bumping into a police patrol. In the neighboring countries, they view the state of exception favorably. It's changed lives. There's a before and after for many people, especially in the most vulnerable areas. They actually feel safer. They can walk around. The police may bother them, but in comparison, that is not as bad as before. So they accept the Mano Dura measures and they accept this treatment from the police. But at the same time, these extraordinary measures violate the Constitution and they change. In Guatemala, they don't accept the fact that the police can go into their homes, they can go into their phones, they can go into their bags, and they can be sent to jail. In El Salvador, maybe it's the same. They don't accept it so much, but they say it may happen. This gave us security, and that's what we wanted. So they don't agree with it so much, but it is what it is. And when it comes to choosing, they'd rather have less stringent measures than what the state of exception implies and what the Bukele government is offering. It's important to highlight the fact that democracy is very precarious in all three countries, not just El Salvador, but also Honduras and Guatemala. And people perceive that there's not a lot of trust, and they say that there's not a lot of democracy. So the idea that El Salvador exchanged democracy for security might not be as true. People say politicians never delivered on their promises, but now they are delivering on security. So we didn't lose so much, but they actually gave us something that's very important. That's very important to understand. This is something that shows us that El Salvador was not a perfect democracy, but people actually did not have rights. But what actually happens is El Salvador is being looked up. It used to be the most unsafe country in the region, and now it's the safest. And the neighboring countries are wondering, why not them? That's some sort of magical thinking. That's what they want. And it's possible because it is possible in El Salvador. However, they don't know very well what happened in El Salvador. And there's a lot of social media play at play. But they are open to having leaders that may achieve what El Salvador is achieving or what El Salvador has achieved. There is a lot of despair in Guatemala and Honduras over politicians that have not been able to achieve what El Salvador has. When? I'm so sorry. I would like to open the moderated part of our event, so I'm so sorry, but I will have some further questions for you. However, I would like to start off with a question for Chris in our moderated part of the event. And it's about something that you were mentioning, that's something that Wim was mentioning. It's the short-term problem, Chris. Sometimes we have seen that in the short term, Mano Dura policies may reduce crime and increase the perception of safety. However, it has been observed that in the middle and long term, new criminal actors may fill the voids and diversify criminal activity. In the dialogues that you held at CSIS, what were some of the long-term effects of Mano Dura? Because we're just focused on short-term policy sometimes, as Wim mentioned. So how can governments in Latin America and the Caribbean balance the needs of short-term safety and the protection of democratic institutions in the long term? Chris, you're muted. So sorry. It's a problem that affects us all. I wanted to tell you that the effects highlighted by the participants, the long-term effects, include the concentration of political power given the popularity of these measures when they make it possible to recover economical activities, working without fear of extortion, recovering public spaces, using public transportation, going out to the streets at night. These policies grant excessive power, as Wim and Lucia were saying, to the state security forces because they're not controlled, they're unchecked, and they are not accountable, especially when they're constantly renewed, as is the case in El Salvador. This means that not only do they go unchecked in their abuse, but they can also become the extortionists themselves. And they fill the voids left by the gangs that used to perform extortion. Other changes involve changes in behavior. People may try to limit their contact with police. For instance, a tattoo in an underserved neighborhood may give out a young person. These states of exception should last just enough to achieve the desired impact. They should not last as long. Besides, the governments should also focus on longer-term solutions which need investment, such as local solutions, community police, evidence-based strategies, and social programs and violence prevention programs to help groups that might be vulnerable to recruitment by criminal groups. Thank you so much, Chris. I have one more question for Lucia, and it's about the concept in your idea of different types of Mano Dura. We might easily understand Mano Dura as the institutional Mano Dura, the performative Mano Dura, etc. But what really caught my attention was civil Mano Dura. Could you please talk a little bit about civil Mano Dura? And also, how can coverage and media outlets amplify fear among society in an intentional way or not? Yes, actually, it's very interesting. In fact, Latin America has had civil Mano Dura actions for a long time. If you think about it, several years ago, maybe 10 years ago, we already had research in place about the increase in lynchings. Lynchings not only in countries such as Guatemala, Bolivia, Peru, incrementally, which were linked to problems focused on insecurity. What happens is a structural problem. That's what we have. And it's very highly connected. It's impossible to disaggregate it. One of the pieces is the feeling of orphanage that Latin America has in general, the feeling that justice is inefficient, that there's a revolving door, and it is a feeling, and in several cases, it's a reality as well. And also the fact that crime has been gaining space, that perception. What is the crime that that engenders most involvement? It's extortion. It's no longer something that's far away. It's like migrant trafficking, drug trafficking. No, when you're extorted, that's something that you suffer day by day. So civil Mano Dura is linked to these types of civil-based actions. For instance, let's come together and pitch in for a security camera. It can be positive, actually. Let's have a citizen security committee. Sometimes it can control crime or prevent crime, but sometimes it can turn into lynching, whistleblowing. So the connection with the media is sometimes the conversations on civil Mano Dura are based not just, as Chris said, on evidence or knowing what works and what doesn't, but based on what's heard in daily conversation in social media, in media outlets that sometimes make the effort or emphasize on quick results, direct achievements, but not necessarily on the consequences of these types of initiatives. And sometimes they acknowledge their right to protect themselves. When you find a reaction from the citizenry, although there is no study pointing at media outlets as a point of origin, they are undoubtedly a point of convergence. It's important for Mano Dura to move into different spheres. We have seen citizens asking for Mano Dura at home, in schools. So it's no longer justice, but it's also order and higher authority verging into authoritarianism. And we can see that in different parts of mediatic conversation. Thank you so much for this explanation, Lucia. It's very important. One question for Wim. Have you asked people in Central America whether they trusted the judicial system? And if so, how did the interviewees assess human rights abuse in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras? Well, thank you for this question. I think it's a very relevant question. We did not conduct surveys. We had focus groups. And El Salvador used to be this way, but there used to be a lack of trust and justice for several reasons. One is a disconnect. People thought that corruption was rampant. They thought judges had other interests, the police was corrupt. And this is the case in Guatemala and Honduras, and the justice system is tainted. And El Salvador is a bit different, although people will not necessarily say they have a lot of trust. There's a division in the legal system. There's the bad guys, the gang members, and the justice works for them. Maybe justice doesn't work so much for common citizens. And the recurring topic in terms of justice in Honduras and Guatemala is not as recurring in El Salvador. Sometimes the police asks for bribes in order not to send someone to jail, but this is not mentioned. This doesn't mean it doesn't happen. What Chris has mentioned is very important here. The officialist discourse on state of exception, the highlights of the government on what they have done is very important. And a lot of judges and police members retired, and the members of the Supreme Court changed. And people view this as change. And they say, well, at least it works. Not for us, but it does for them. Thank you, Wim. I see there are some questions on our Zoom chat, but before, I have one question for Chris. And it's leaders that achieve improvement in public security are highly popular and have high rates of approval. How can this media create a narrative that's stronger to counter the anti-democratic narratives of these leaders? It's a very similar question to one that we have on our chat. Yes, thank you, Ryan. This is the question that was hardest to answer by our group. And frankly, I don't know whether we did find a satisfactory answer to this. It's very hard in countries like El Salvador, which have seen such high rates of criminality, some of the highest homicide rates in the world, and a systematic extortion problem that affected people that are just trying to survive. One thing that seems to be working is amplifying voices of people who have suffered under Mano Dura. For instance, the families of young people who have been incarcerated, who died in jail, or people who were imprisoned, wrongly imprisoned, elevating their voices and amplifying them on social media and digital media in order to sort of moderate enthusiasm over Mano Dura. What's important is to counter propaganda messages with an equal amount of messages on the damage caused by Mano Dura. Thank you, Chris. I see that we have some comments and questions on the chat. Thank you to our assistant administrator for responding to some of these questions live. We have only 4 minutes left, so with the time we have left, it's better to open a space for final remarks, starting with Lucia, then Chris, and then Wim. We only have 4 minutes left, so let's have a flash round of final remarks, starting with Lucia. Thank you, Ryan. I want to say 3 things. First, we need more studies. We need to continue with this understanding of the topic. This is not the first nor the last study, but this is an issue that is remaining here in Latin America, and we need to improve our understanding of it. Second, we need to strengthen a mechanism for understanding these mechanisms or alternative mechanisms. This is not to say that we are against Mano Dura, but we need to know whether these actions are really positive or whether they're just installing a discourse on punishment as the sole response possible. Third, our study is called Mano Dura and Erosion of Democracy. In fact, the hardest Mano Dura models have components of democratic erosion, such as the loss of importance of the other branches of power, the generation of mass justice, the indiscriminate use of preventative imprisonment. So it is important to take into account the role of political discussion and public policy in these areas. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lucia. Chris, final remarks? Yes. To be brief, I just want to send a message. We should not have to decide between security and democracy. I think it was the assistant administrator who said this is a false dichotomy, and we should just focus on countering this. Thank you, Chris. And finally, Wim, your final remarks, please. What I learned in the study was the importance of talking to normal people who usually don't appear in studies, asking them what they think. And I feel with everything that we've done, security for them has not been valued correctly. And this is important to build alternative, compelling discourses. Because if we don't understand the concerns of people, how are we going to create an alternative discourse for them? And it's very important because I feel in the past few decades, if we look at Latin America, but if we compare South America and Central America, Mano Dura is getting worse. We can see that there's Mano Dura 1, and then there's 2.0. And now we have the state of exception. And that's there's no respect for the law there. And we need to see what's going on there. Thank you. I don't know if the assistant administrator would like to offer some closing remarks. It's not necessary. No? Just thank you for the space for this dialogue. And I see that we have a lot of colleagues who are devoted to working on this. And thank you so much. Well, thank you. And thank you all to all of our panelists and to USAID for being our partner in this very important project. I know that this topic of Mano Dura continues to be highly important in Latin America. So we're going to continue studying it. And I heard that we need more studies about it. So I hope that we have more chances to collaborate with all of you. But for now, thank you so much and have a great rest of the day.